Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 720, September 22nd, 1985, the first full day of fall season. I love the season changes. People in the east and northeast don't think we have them in Carmel, but 1 degree of temperature is a change of season out here, and it's particularly beautiful all year, and fall is wonderful. This time of year, I begin to think about recipes for the holidays and sewing things, gifts for the holidays, and it's hard to concentrate on the news. And every year I find my hobbies of sewing and cooking get less attention, and I'm doing more reading and more outlining of articles because while I want to do both, it's impossible to do so much of everything. And so that other end is something is giving, and it's the sewing and the cooking projects. I'm sorry for those who used to receive the gifts, but those of you that like World Watchers, you gain by getting more and better news, as I do less of that. Not better, but increased intensity with my studying more of the material. I want to tell you about another researcher who has a newsletter coming out. In the last few weeks, I told you about David Emery, E-M-O-R-Y, who has Radio Free America series, and John Judge, who has articles, tapes, reprints of other people's articles. And you can write to me, self-addressed, stamped envelope, if you didn't get their names or addresses. And another researcher is Ted Gandolfo. Those who have studied the John Kennedy assassination and the murder of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy know his name. It's Gandolfo, 1214 First Avenue, New York City, New York, 10021. He is going to have a newsletter called Assassination USA. It will be $15 a year for 12 copies. He is a person who has taped very many prominent people involved in all the investigation and of the political assassinations. He's had his own video channel, done some programs in New York City. The videotapes are available. He has documents from the National Archives that have been released that he's going to share in his newsletter. And I'm going to start photocopying some of my documents that I got from David Lifton that were in the National Archives and share with you, because I'll never get out a newsletter and I can't possibly use all of this in a lifetime. And he may as well have it in printed form so that you can see it. When I talk about Isaac Don Levine wanting the CIA to bring the daughters of Mr. Alexander Zeiger from Minsk Radio Factory to Argentina before the Warren Commission report came out, you can see the correspondence for yourself as well as my discussing it and make photocopies. So I'll share this research with Ted as soon as I get time to copy some of the documents. Now, the morning paper, the Monterey Herald today, has a story on the National Security Council. Very important article because they began to be more visible, this invisible government, at the time that the training of the Contras was exposed as having been advised by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a national security staff aide, who reportedly provided military advice to the rebels fighting Nicaragua's present regime, and helps them raise money from outside sources, which could be the drug companies, from the mafia, from the Vatican, from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and all the other agencies, excluding the title CIA, because Congress said CIA can't do it, but anybody else can. Now, I have said that the National Security Council, formed in 1947, started the Nazification of America because it took away from the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branches of our government and became the decision maker to tell the president and the Congress what they want. And I believe it is a cabal set up by the Nazis from World War II and the bankers and the institutions that put the Hitler and Franco and Mussolini into power, and who through all these years have made coups in one country after the other and overthrown countries and put in military dictatorships and escalated narcotics traffic as a means to control the native population, including people in America. Now, the article is titled National Security Council Staff Influence Continues to Grow. And I'll read you part of the article. The story says the National Security Council's behind-the-scenes maneuvering was helpful in getting Reverend Benjamin Weir out of Lebanon. Now, they're taking credit for that because you can't see them. I don't believe for a minute that they maneuvered that, but the president wants the responsibility. of his agency doing the work, and so the National Security Council is taking the credit for it. But the article says, organized nearly 4 decades ago primarily to process paperwork for the president, the staff of the little-known White House agency at times undertakes tasks that could be assigned to the State Department, the Defense Department, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, in case you don't speak the same language, I will translate that for you. It was organized 4 decades ago, not primarily at all to process paper for the president. And the reason the staff is little known is that it is the government behind the government. I put that in my first published article in 1972, The Parallel Governments, and that its role was to take over State Department, Defense Department, and the CIA. They say that could be assigned, but they have pulled the power away from those puppets and are the decision makers. The story goes on, the National Security Council is far less accountable to Congress, and it operates outside of the public eye, but its influence inside the government appears to be growing. Translated for you, once again, a foreign language. What is happening, the National Security Council is not accountable to Congress at all, and it operates outside the public eye because the public is blind. If you wanted to read about it, I read and share with you as much as I can in a given hour. It's not out of your eye, and you better open your eyes or get eye surgery because it's there. It's not so invisible. But the reason it appears to be growing is that the Heritage Foundation, the Mellons, Richard Mellon Scaife, the think tanks, the religious right, the Falwells, that advise the National Security Council on Armageddon, on this necessity for us to have a holy war, to die. It is advised by the religious freaks that want the war, by the multinationals that think they can escape it, and they are operating in place of Congress. That's why they're supposed to be secret. The article explains that some academic experts think that they should stick to policy making and leave the operational details to State and Defense Department. Those academic experts are so hazy. They're like Rip Van Winkles that just woke up. The operational details of State and Defense Department are second. The National Security Council is first. Then the article says the council is just doing what it seems to do, and it's growing more or less steadily, at least since the Kennedy administration, and its role is no cause for concern. The staff is just doing what it was supposed to be doing, at least since the Kennedy. Now, they throw in the Kennedy, which has nothing to do with John Kennedy. The reason it escalated in power after the Kennedy administration is the reason they killed John Kennedy, to take the power away from the president. The president, John Kennedy, said there's a hidden government behind my back, and fired Allen Dulles, who set up the Security Council with William Donovan and Reinhard Gehlen and the top Nazis, and Heinrich Himmler's Waffen-SS, the Gestapo. Then the article says observers noticed that the council that was established in 1947 is doing much more than it did in its early days under President Truman and Eisenhower. Now, that's end of quote. Translation from that Greek article by Mae Brussell. It was established in 1947 under Truman and Eisenhower, but it escalated its muscle every year because Kennedy was killed, Robert Kennedy was killed, Martin Luther King was killed, Adlai Stevenson was killed. William Stevenson was killed too, the FBI, director of Division 5. But Adlai Stevenson, Frank Church, Hubert Humphreys did, all the old so-called liberal Democrats, if they ever were, are on their way out, never did speak up about this agency, and for a long time it's been visible. But the reason it's gotten its muscle since the Kennedy administration is that with Richard Nixon, who brought Nikolai Malaks of the Iron Guard to his office in Whittier, did you ever wonder why people didn't ask why he was doing that? And Mr. Trivia and all the Nazis that he was connected with, and I was the first person that I know of in this country to link Richard Nixon to the Nazi connections, and nobody hardly speaks of Ronald Reagan's Nazi connections. Overthrow in New York is going to publish an issue on the Nixon-Reagan Nazi connections. But they got their muscle after all their contenders were dead and they're home free. Now, the national security members include President Reagan, Killer Bush, Schultz, Bechtel Schutz, Caspar Weinberger, William Casey, the Knight of Malta, of course, William Crowe, Jr., Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. That's the National Security Council. They realize now that it is having more influence. It's having more influence as it takes away the policies. If Congress says the Contras can have some money, but the CIA can't dispense it for weapons, then the National Security Council calls in John Singlaub and Heine Adderhold and Fred Ickley and Mr. Lansdale of the whole covert operation of Vietnam and through the John Kennedy assassination. And they say, oh, Congress doesn't want that. How? Well, Congress doesn't know what they need. And I've mentioned this before. Well, we'll just do what we want. That's the National Security Council. People better get off their high horses, take off their dark glasses, and realize that it's been visible for a long time and that it has totally wiped out the purpose and means of the Constitution, and they try to change it through their little laws. Every day there's some new little law taking away our freedom. Now, there's a subject that I have long avoided, not for any particular reason, and I feel guilty about it. I guess this is the only thing I've ever apologized for, that I haven't done more on the American Indian, and I really should. I always thought that getting rid of the leaders in this country was primary because they are killers and assassins, and they're genocidal all over the world, but I've never dealt enough with the American Indians, and when this situation came up in South Africa, where people were being relocated, where they were moving from their ancestral homes where they would be starved, and a genocide of starvation because they wouldn't be where they could raise food, the Americans responded to the South African need, but nothing about the genocide in America. But there is a chance now, and I'll do some more. I did a little bit on the influence of Adolf Hitler with Mr. Mays and his studying the American rounding up of the Indians so that if he were criticized, he could say, this is what you did. But the same people that put Hitler in power have done this to the Indians, along with a lot of people not quite so powerful. There's a story in the paper this week. Over 14,000 traditional Navajo and Hopi people are living in Four Corners area of Arizona. They are planning to relocate them. Companies such as Peabody Coal are pressuring them to move out of their land. There are a lot of resources there: oil, coal, uranium, minerals, all kinds of deposits. The excuse was to settle differences between the Hopi and the Navajos, who've lived in this area for centuries in peace and have their ceremonies and interests in common. This recent article says historically the Indians were forced off their lands, and now there is a bill before Congress, Public Law 93-531, and I want every one of you world watchers to write to Senate members and members of the House of Representatives on Public Law 93-531. Senator Dennis De Concini of Arizona has said, and this is a quote, to force 9,525 people to become refugees in 20th century America is an act of cultural genocide. It would be a blot on the conscience of the United States government. And he compared it to the forced relocation in Africa. Well, I don't think there is a conscience of the United States government, but there are people. There are people raising money for starvation in Africa. There are people raising money for the farms that are closing. So people should get together and stop this moving of the Hopi and the Navajo Indians, Hopi, it's pronounced Hopi actually, away from their cultural lands and not give the territory to these greedy companies for coal, uranium, and other minerals. Again, the National Security Council would say, well, that's national defense. We need the uranium to make more bombs, and if we don't get it from South Africa, let's kick the Indians off their land. They interpret what is national defense, what we need, and then push the president to do it. People don't have a conscience anymore, but if you have a brain, some of us have a brain, write to members of Congress and use your information on World Watchers to try and help these people. I don't know how many of you watched Farm Aid this past Sunday. It was very moving. We didn't get the whole program. I don't have the cable that gets the whole thing, but I watched about 3 hours and taped it. 280,000 farms closed in 3 years And I watched the program with a lot of irony as it proceeded. The farms and the farmers are basically conservative. They were the home of the rednecks of America. They hated the hippies. They would shoot at them. They were a disease worse than AIDS and leprosy combined. 49 states voted for Ronald Reagan. The only one state that didn't vote was Minnesota. They're losing a lot of farms, but they did it for Mondale's purposes. That's his home state. Neil Young, a activist from way back, was singing trying to raise money for the very farmers that wouldn't mind if he were trapped in jail forever. Bob Dylan was the fellow who got up at the aid program for Ethiopia and said we should save the American farmers. The Jew boy from Minnesota was singing his heart out there for these farmers who would have put him up on a cross and burned him, and maybe still might want to. The farmers are part of the Posse Comitatus. You can't generalize, but basically very conservative, never objected to the Vietnam War. The country western were making fun of the Vietnam War and the refuseniks that wouldn't go to war and the people that stayed home and were entertained in the White House of all the presidents because of their gallant pro-American stand. Well, Ronald Reagan was their president. The flag waved through their farms, and George Bush and the whole gang went parading, and they all voted for him en masse. And I can understand the first time around why the old actor, the co-star with Errol Flynn, the old Gestapo buddies, but the second time around, unless the voting machines are rigged, it's pathetic. Now, I think the farms should be saved, and they're the backbone of America, and the threat, of course, was that if we don't save these farms, then the Europeans will buy the land and raise our price of food. Not the fact that it's being sold to the Europeans, but that you may spend more for your bread. And this country is being sold out and right in front of our eyes. I feel sorry. I would like to see the farms saved, and I would like the farmers someday to do something to understand what is happening. There's a very moving scene with Sissy Spacek interviewed, and she was appealing for aid for the farmers, and she described her life in Texas as a redneck, and maybe some of you might have seen the interview, and no political aspirations or not. She is political now as an activist. She's not going to run for office, but no stand on anything, and as she said, a real redneck. And the turning point was when she made the movie Missing. And when the movie was over and she was sitting in Washington, D.C., and the Harmon family were there, the mother and father and the cast and the producers, and she realized that Charles Harmon wasn't there and that he was actually dead and killed and that these things happen. There was a turning point in her life. And I hope that out of this, if people could reach these farmers individually and tell them the turning point is in Washington. It's with these people who don't care any more than they do about the peasants in Nicaragua or El Salvador or Guatemala or Chile or the Philippines or South Korea or Iran or Kuwait or India. They care nothing but power and minerals and oil resources, and that people are nothing. And when people help each other, they are bigger than that handful that runs the government, and that's what should come out of that movement. Now, last week I mentioned the reunion of the veterans of World War II, a particular group that went to Frankfurt, Germany, and they had their little reunion with the Waffen-SS. At the site, they celebrated the end of the Battle of the Bulge, that horrendous battle, and the man who organized this meeting, one of the directors of the SS, said, "We nurture our friendship. It has nothing to do with politics." That's Wilhelm Gottenstroder, director of the Waffen-SS Veterans Organization for the Annual Encounters with Former Enemies. It has nothing to do with politics, the way they hug each other. And then there was another quotation that in the United States, people were objecting, the Jewish people, to their meeting. And they made the statement that the war is over, forget it, and that we can't be involved in all of this. We're not worried about atrocities. And there's been a lot of fuss raised, but the quotation of Delmile Omholt, the president of the 70th Infantry, said, "This is the only year a fuss has been raised about our meeting, and memories are fading, and some people want to jog their memories. The war is 40 years old. It's time to put it into history," Omholt said here. "We're out to check the old battlefields and to meet our friends." And as I say, the Waffen-SS director, Gottenstroder, said, "This had nothing to do with politics." Well, it has a lot to do with politics, and had been spending the weekend outlining a book that I wanted to share with you, many pages in the future. But one chapter that's important is on a man, Werner Naumann, who works with the Waffen-SS, a very important survivor of the bunker, was with Adolf Hitler up till the very last, and with Mr. Goebbels. And Martin Bormann, walked out with Martin Bormann. The book is called The New Nazis of Germany by Wellington Long. It was published in London and New York, 1968. Chilton Book Company, a small publisher. And to show you the continuity of then to now, Mr. Naumann, Werner Naumann, this is just one person, and later I'll do some other chapters with you, was the head of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda offices. He was the personal head of it, appointed by Adolf Hitler as the Nazi propaganda minister state secretary. Werner Naumann, Hitler named him to be the successor to Goebbels when the war was over and the government was headed by Grand Admiral Karl Donitz. And Naumann was in the bunker with the Goebbels. He shook hands with him goodbye. He kissed Magna Goebbels goodbye. He walked out with Hitler's deputy, Martin Bormann, and Hitler's youth leader, Arthur Axmann, Axmann. It was Axmann who said Bormann had been killed by a bridge after leaving the bunker. And according to this book, and we all know it's true, the story wasn't believed because there was no corroborating witness. Now, Naumann was alive. What he did was he took off his identification as being an SS major, anything identifying him as Goebbels' state secretary. He became an ordinary Wehrmacht soldier with a different name, and this would take a little bit of planning. You know, those last few years, the Nazis go underground. He was taken by the Russians and released in 1946, 1 year after the war. Then he went to East Germany, then West Germany, and he lived in Frankfurt, where he worked as a laborer, and he avoided the denazification process. And in 1950, the government gave amnesty to everyone who had taken an assumed name. Now, they knew in 1950 that they would all be free if they took an assumed name and hid. And this book, The New Nazis of Germany, tells that in 1944, in July, before the war was over, the FREIKORPS, the same organization that got Hitler into power in the early years, the FREIKORPS, the FREIKORPS set a date for July 20th, 1951, that they would emerge again as an organization, and they had a secret meeting in Hamburg, August 17th, 1951, just a few days after the date that they were to meet that was set in 1944. That's how deep this Waffen-SS story goes. So he survived until 1950 when they all surfaced, and his early career started with the Gestapo, the Nazi Party, in 1923, helping Hitler, 1928 rather, helping Hitler to power in 1933. In 1944, he got his highest appointment with Joseph Goebbels and Adolf Hitler and became the right-hand man to see that everything the Goebbels ordered was carried through. During the years, he was giving ideas to Goebbels, the propaganda minister. He was so important. He made sure that all the orders were executed. He reached all the top executives. He knew hundreds of men and where to reach them after the war. And the interesting thing about Mr. Naumann is that he then connects with Hans Ulrich Rudel, who was flying Adolf Hitler and Martin Bormann's possessions out of Germany for 1 year, and Rudel is the common denominator between Hans Ulrich Rudel, between the Aryan nations up in Idaho, in California, connecting to the very people who assassinated John Kennedy. And Hans Ulrich Rudel was working with paymaster Hans Saddlemeyer, the courier to Joseph Mengele down in Brazil, and setting up the cocaine traffic. And a constant, Saddlemeyer was a constant traveler down to Brazil, and Hans Ulrich Rudel worked with him. They worked with the Aryan nations, and that global network of the Odessa was tied together. And I mentioned earlier on broadcast that Mr. von Oven, General von Oven in Argentina, who was Goebbels' secretary, was the person that the men that I knew that went to South America to talk to Mengele and knew about his connection to Klaus Barbie. You had to go through Mr. von Oven, Goebbels' secretary, and Goebbels' highest assistant, who must have been over von Oven, kept a list of all the names of people and diary to contact later. Now, in this book, The New Nazis of Germany, it tells that during the next 2 years, after he was able to surface and said, I had changed my name, there was a fever of activity. He renewed his old friendships, his acquaintances all over Germany, restored the broken links to foreign fascists during business trips to Italy, France, and Belgium. With British fascist Sir Oswald Mosley, he gave a luncheon for him in his Paris home, and they kept up on international situations. His cover work was a salesman for prefabricated houses and huts, but this book says it was incidental to his politicking, and he kept out of sight. And later, in a book he published, he said politics appears to have been his only hobby. That's why when the Waffen-SS said this week it wasn't political, they signed a bond a long time ago to keep this thing going. Minister Naumann said in his book, actually there wasn't a day I didn't receive at least one political visitor. Now, he doesn't tell you if it was Henry Kissinger or Fritz Kramer or SS Karl Wolff and Hans Ulrich Rudel he worked with, but it's very important to know that he continuously was working, and they set these dates ahead. Now, the FREIKORPS in America is John Singlaub working with the National Security Council and setting up the paramilitary, the Soldier of Fortune, with Robert Brown and Clint Murchison and the oil people, and Hunt sending up their secret armies for assassinations and murders that I'll go into in a moment. But the FREIKORPS decision was made in 1944, as I say, that they would be meeting in 1951. There was a time spot area for each time they would escalate their meetings. In 1943 they went under, in 1945 they would change their names, and in 1950 they could surface if their name had been changed. In 1951 the FREIKORPS would start again, and their meetings were off by August of 1951. Now, this book tells about Mr. Naumann was arrested for a while by the Adenauer government because he was a threat that the Nazis were going to try and take over the government when Adenauer was the first chancellor there. And February the 11th, they had 1951. They had a meeting to dissolve the paramilitary group who had formed because it was too early. The FREIKORPS Deutschland was bound by Hitler's oath temporarily in 1951. They had to go under again. They weren't ready for them, but were ready now. The court showed that they were gangs of former soldiers who roamed Germany after World War I, the FREIKORPS. They murdered politicians, which is what is happening in this country and other countries around the world. But I've studied particularly this country. The FREIKORPS murdered politicians who tried to come to terms with their victors. They said they were fighting the communists in the streets. And according to right-wing mythology, the FREIKORPS, according to what they say, saved Germany from the Reds and put Hitler into power. Now, the new FREIKORPS, according to the book The New Nazis, as I say, was formed at a secret meeting in Hamburg, August 17, 1951. And the SS Fraternal Association, the Waffen-SS, was there. And they, in 1944, set the charter to July 20th, dated it ahead to 1951, and began meeting August 17, 1951. Now, the New Nazis of Germany goes on. Colonel Hans Ulrich Rudel, a Nazi air ace, was one of the sponsors and official heroes of the FREIKORPS. As I say, he's the liaison to Martin Bormann, to Joseph Mengele, to the Nazis in South America, and he's the liaison to the Nazi computer network in the United States, the clans, the Nazis that became the Aryan nations, the Order, the Survivalists. Hans Ulrich Rudel and Otto Skorzeny were the kingpins to that international network going in and out of every organization, and they're linked to Permindex and to the assassination teams that oft our President of the United States and Senator Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, as well as hundreds of other people. This book describes members were required to promise absolute obedience and secrecy. They were identified by records only in a number and a cover name. Membership cards had numbers only. New members had ritualistic mumbo-jumbo ritual explanations and services, and they recruited people under the oath that there would be a terrible revenge and severity of the FREIKORPS if any of them revealed what they were doing, and the FREIKORPS killed many of their own. Now, down in Brazil, the Bossert family that housed Joseph Mengele and the Stammers were the people quoted by Simon Wiesenthal and the United States Department of Justice and Bonn as being the authorities on Joseph Mengele. And when he died, those people were part of the Odessa. And the resurgence again via Mr. Rudell and Mr. Naumann and their network to sworn secrecy. So telling a lie is nothing new to them. And the story of Mengele dying in 1979 gave him his wings to fly around the world. This book is about the Freikorps, how it was formed, when it was formed, and the connections to Mr. Rudell. And it's very important because Goebbels' secretary in Argentina, the contact man, and Mr. Naumann, Goebbels' top boy, appointed by Hitler to take over after Donitz, after he died, or if he died, and after Donitz would be the head of Germany. I'll take a 1-minute break and go back a little bit on this and then to some other stories in the news. But don't think that that reunion was not political, and don't think that it wasn't planned. I said when Ronald Reagan went to Bitburg that he had to go. There was a commitment, and that was as important for the president to go this year as it was for the Freikorps to emerge in 1951 on a time slot. Nothing could stop that. Let's take this 1-minute break, and then I'll be back with you some more on this matter. This is Mae Brussell, and this is the second half of a program called World Watchers, program number 720. I would like to get about 8 hours of material into a half hour, and so before I escalate that speed, let me just tell you again that you can write to me, Mae, M-A-E, Brussell, B-R-U-S-S-E-L-L, send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I will send you the bibliography of this program or any of the past broadcasts if you designate which ones. A 22-cent stamped envelope, legal size, will hold 4 bibliography sheets. Unless there's 5 to the month, you can get 4 out of the 5 and request one of the others later. You can say, I'd like the sheets from August or September, and get 4 at one time if you don't want them each week right on the button. And I fill envelopes, and I'm glad to do that. So you can get these books from the library or bookstores or used bookstores and look up some of this material, because I could just barely touch it on these programs. And getting back to that reunion of the Waffen SS, again at the scene of the Battle of the Bulge with some American veterans, a handful of veterans going there from Wisconsin can bring home messages for all of the Aryan nations and put into computers around the United States. All that hugging and kissing wasn't to relive the Battle of the Bulge. It's to send messages that you don't put on wire services to continue the escalation or the time bomb of what you're going to do to this country to overthrow it, which places are going to be bombed, which airplanes are going to be destroyed, who's going to be killed, and there's a coordination around the world. And one way to have that is to have these particular meetings. Now, Joseph Goebbels, head of Minister of Propaganda for Joseph Goebbels, this Werner Naumann, also helped in Europe to get out hundreds of books and publications by former SS majors, SS officers from the Waffen SS, and flood Europe and begin, once they surfaced in the 50s, to get information out about the war, what the real nature of the war was, how great Hitler is, and so forth. And one of the peoples they wrote about, their Nazi heroes, was Rudell, who set up the second Freikorps, Hans Ulrich Rudell, the only man who got Germany's Golden Oak Leaf Award, the cluster with the sword with diamonds, and the knights. He was very close to Adolf Hitler. He also wrote in his books, Hans Ulrich Rudell wrote the essence of what is going on in the world, that the actual purpose of this war was to save the world because of the danger of communism, and that is one of the reasons we're armed today, and that Star Wars isn't negotiable, and that we're going to work with Germany on the Star Wars project, which puts us again with Daniel Graham, General Daniel Graham of the Defense Intelligence Agency and High Frontier, the most visible spokesman for the Star Wars projects, sharing offices with Fritz Kramer, that mysterious Fritz Kramer, the mentor of Henry Kissinger, who I believe is Hitler's top general. And just this past week, there was a story that they are merging the Americans and the Germans on the Star Wars project. Rudell wrote in his book, one of the books on rearmament, in quotes, the attack against Russia was not only a German defensive measure, it was an international necessity. not a defensive war, but a crusade, not only for Germany, but for Europe, beyond Europe, for the whole world. And that is what is being sold to the Aryan nations, as I said, who changed their cloak from the Klan and the Nazis and the Minutemen to the Aryan nations, the survivalists, the Freikorps. And that's why John Singlaub, the head of the American Freikorps on the board of Western Goals, the man whose picture has been in all the newspapers just this past week, John Singlaub wears about 7 different coats. He works with the World Anti-Communist League as the head of that. They had their convention in Dallas this week. He works in the National Security Council. He's on the board of Western Goals with Edward Teller, the daddy of the hydrogen bomb, and the High Frontier with Helene connections. I could run down all those 8 or 9, actually the 8 or 9 garments of Singlaub, which I may do in one broadcast. Western Goals also had the late Larry McDonald from the John Birch Society, the head of the John Birch Society, and Roy Cohn with his New York Mafia connections. And Roy Cohn is the liaison between the Vatican and the FBI. He was during the Cardinal Spellman years, and he's just as thick with these people now. Now, 2 years ago, I was discussing the Hitler diaries and the names that surfaced when the Hitler diaries surfaced, and the people that were in the bunker with Adolf Hitler, whose names were present and are meeting today. The only one that allegedly died since then, and I don't see and know any proof that he died, was SS Karl Wolff. But that Gerd Heidemann had the yacht of Goering and worked with SS Karl Wolff and Franz Westermeier, very important, Adolf Hitler, and Karl Munke, who was in the Battle of the Bulge, the same people having their reunion. I won't go over those names again. I did broadcast, it was 594 and 595 on the Hitler diary and the links to the Kennedy assassination. That was in May of 1983. Quoted a book, The Damned Engineers, about General Wilhelm Munke of the SS Panzer Division and so forth. Munke is alive and living in Europe, and I'll share with you some newspaper articles that just came out recently about him. But it's very important to know that this gang that were with Hitler in the bunker until the last hours included the same person, Mr. Naumann, who was the head of the Minister of Propaganda, chief of the Ministry of Propaganda for Goebbels, who then could parlay a lot of money that was released by Otto Skorzeny and the Swiss banks, particularly after Evita Peron was dead, into the resurgence of the Nazis and out of Europe. Mushroom, the newspaper, television later, and the printed books and magazines of the resurgence of Nazi Germany. And that's all very important. It's important because this Naumann worked with Gerhard Frey, a propagandist, and I'll do more on him next week. Hopefully I keep saying that, but Gerhard Frey is a well-known publisher in Germany, and he's the fellow that connects to General Walker, Edwin Walker, and Edwin Walker called Gerhard Frey to say Oswald the communist shot at me in April. I'll go through those details with you next week, but there's one part of a book we've talked about often, and I have never detailed this particular section. The book Spooks goes into they don't call it the American Freikorps, but it connects, and well, maybe I should break down those connections for you now. Well, I have them. The book Spooks is by Jim Hogan, Hougan. It came out in 1978. It's one of the finest books on the military spy system, the intelligence system, that hidden government, which really isn't hidden. This has been out since 1948. But in this book, there's a chapter called The Paladins, and he describes, it's on page 74, 75, just a few sections of this I'll share with you. He said, millionaire such as Nelson Rockefeller and the late John Paul Getty hired former Secret Service, CIA, FBI agents to handle a variety of sensitive assignments within their organizations, protecting not only their property, but their commercial secrets and their persons as well. Now, just to interject this again, he's saying that millionaires such as Nelson Rockefeller and Getty hired former agents. Well, George DeMohrenschildt, the gentleman who meets Lee and Marina Oswald when they come home in June 1962 from the Soviet Union, carried a blank check from Nelson Rockefeller when he traveled down to Mexico and Corpus Christi as a spy and wanted as a Nazi spy suspected during World War II. He worked under the cover of Nelson Rockefeller, and John Paul Getty set up an organization in California that took Otto von Bolschwing of the SS, one of Hitler's top people, and Reinhard Gehlen's right-hand man, who set up the spy network for Reinhard Gehlen in America and in South America and in Europe when Gehlen left this country to be head of the BND, the German intelligence. So John Paul Getty sets up a corporation, TCI, which later connects to Edwin Wilson and Frank Turpel and our CIA, but used Helene von Damm, our ambassador now to Austria, who soon retire, as their secretary. Otto von Bolschwing was one of the very top Nazis of the Iron Guard, the Romanian Iron Guard. He was above Adolf Eichmann and lived here in California and traveled under the eyes of the organization of John Paul Getty and also other companies, including the Cabots back east, the Cabot Lodges, and so forth. So they used their corporations, or the Howard Hughes organization, for spying for political assassinations, just as the Hughes organization used Robert Mayu to hire John Rosselli and Sam Giancana and members of organized crime to set up death squads. These individuals are not only protecting themselves, they're wiping out people identical to what the Freikorps did in Germany in the earlier period. It resurfaced again in 1951, and America has its Freikorps. It's very important, if I have to repeat that every week. Now, Spooks tells about Getty and Rockefeller. They give two examples. Then he continues, Jim Hogan. Working for the very wealthy can be hazardous to your health, according to former FBI agent Paul Rothermel, Rothermeil. And David Emery discussed him in this chapter of this book. We've been sharing this information. He had it on his program up in KFJC and KKUP, but many of you, of course, in the East and elsewhere don't know or haven't read this chapter or don't remember it. Paul Rothermel was working with H.L. Hunt family in Texas, and he talked to Peter Noyes, a writer, and Peter Noyes is the fellow who made the connections of the survivalists, the Nazis, and clans to Clay Shaw and the Aryan Nation that's up in Idaho right now. Peter Noyes did quite a bit of work into the investigation of John Kennedy, and he closed too quickly and hasn't done a separate chapter. But Rothermel was discussing with Peter Noyes what happened. Rothermel described his peculiar past association with the fabulously wealthy Hunt family of Texas. While employed in the Secret Service of H.L. Hunt, Rothermel said the old man's son, Nelson Bunker Hunt, approached him in connection with a plan to form a paramilitary group for political purposes, a killer force that would train on the desert estates in the West, in the United States, our own death force, a connoisseur of racehorses and right-wing causes. Nelson Bunker Hunt is an important contributor to the John Birch Society and a confidant of its leader, Robert Welch. He is one of the world's richest men, having held the title at one time to all of the oil in Libya. And this is when Gaddafi was trained, of course, by Otto Skorzeny and Hitler's Nazis, and now Gaddafi is giving $5 million to Mr. Farrakhan to affect the American electoral process, which he does so well. Hunt was not content with his mere riches. He wanted to organize the so-called American Volunteer Group, the AVG. Now, this week, the Soldiers of Fortune had their annual convention in Las Vegas, Nevada. They are the missionaries. They work under Robert Brown from Vietnam. Brown was put into business, the magazine Soldier of Fortune, by John Singlaub, and those gung-ho survivalist magazines are part of the American Volunteer Group See, it takes the power away from Congress, from the CIA, the Defense Department, and the National Security Council, which is so secret. These people can work in and out, like John Singlaub, between the volunteer group and the National Security Council. Meanwhile, while the people are being beheaded and cut open and tortured in Central and South America. The American Volunteer Group, which supposedly was to use lethal means of course it's lethal. If you're going to kill people, it would be lethal. It was organized for the purpose of killing. Recounting the story, the former FBI man says the Hunt group planned to recruit a private army from the ranks of General Edwin Walker's John Birch Society cell in Dallas. Now, this is very important. They want a private army. That is what the Freikorps is. Because if it wasn't private, why did Earl Warren cover up General Walker bringing Volkmar Schmidt and Larry Schmidt from Munich, Germany, to go to the home of Robert Morris, a Knight of Malta, a former chief counsel for Senator Joe McCarthy, whose secretary married John Reese, the head of Western Goals. John Sing Laub is on Western Goals. I'll chart this out for you in papers. I don't expect you to remember these names unless you've listened to me for a long, long time. He was going to use a private army from the secret cell in Dallas. The weapon of choice, their first choice, was to be a gas gun imported from Europe, as if our CIA doesn't make them, where the victims would appear to die of a heart attack. Now, how many heart attacks of young people have you been following lately in their 40s and 50s? Civil rights leaders, organizers, concerned people, theater, judges, actors, start reading your obituaries if you haven't been doing it regularly. Asked to join the paramilitary unit that would make a war on liberals and on the left, to kill the liberals and kill the left, Rothermel said he refused. Then his telephone line was tapped, and spies working for H.L. Hunt started to threaten. He was afraid for his life. Naturally, Nelson Bunker Hunt denied all of this, but deniability is a part of it, and this is why Bernard Fensterwald and Harold Weisberg and Sylvia Marr and the other, a handful of researchers, Gary Mack in Texas, I could list 8 or 10 researchers that will not touch the Munich people that came from Munich, Germany, about 19 of them. I've had their names on the air, and I can give you the tapes, the numbers if you write or call me, where I talked about them, that were brought in for the political assassination of John Kennedy and other murders. Americans and some Germans, but mostly Americans, that were working in Munich with General Walker when he was working with Gerhard Frey and Mr. Naumann of the FREIKORPS in Europe. They were to do political assassinations. A former Hunt employee, this Rothermel, remained frightened of his old boss. And then this is where Jim Hogan leaves off. As for the AVG, the American Volunteer Group, itself, its short history is a bloody one that led investigators, mostly Peter Noyes, into the extremist wonderland, seeking the origins and training bases. He interviewed Minuteman Robert Depew, who described the terms of their politics and what they were going to do. Now, when Peter Noyes went into the investigation of that very group, that's when he tapped into the people who killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. The John Birch Society and General Walker. But you see, they're above, they're part of like the National Security Group. They can't work in the Pentagon, and even though John Kennedy brought General Walker home for his political work, they set up the AVG, the American Volunteer Group. Now, many times I've had on the air a reprint of an article from National Tatler about a group called the 5412-2. I'll repeat it again for new listeners, or because it's apropos of the present. It was written by a man, Trowbridge Ford, a political scientist from Holy Cross, a former member of the U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps, who was talking about the relationship of Jack Ruby to the House Un-American activities, and this would be Robert Morris working with Senator Joe McCarthy, and that Jack Ruby was a witness and worked with Richard Nixon. And then this article, as I say, was printed in the Tatler June 1st, 1975. And this article goes into the fact that Kennedy's death could have resulted from action taken by the so-called Special Group 5412-2, a group working within the White House in the late 1950s to coordinate actions of the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, and of course one of the heads of the Defense Intelligence Agency, then later, not then, was to become Daniel Graham, the partner of Kissinger's mentor. As I say, the Fritz Kramer, I'll say it over and over again. And then this article published in 1975 said, operating invisibly under the protection of the National Security Council, the group plotted the assassination of Fidel Castro and outlined what was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Nixon, as vice president, was the action officer for this special group, 5412-2. Others besides Nixon were Alexander Haig, whose name I've been charting for the past month in various charts that I do want to get out. in printed form for you on the coups that Haig has been behind in governments where dictatorships were put in or near misses. Working with Nixon was Alexander Haig, who ultimately became Nixon's last chief of staff, E. Howard Hunt, and the CIA contract employees Frank Sturgis and Bernard Barker. Incidentally, I just found out a few weeks ago that Julio Virgilio Martinez, the gentleman involved with the Watergate entry, and I'll have to spell the name for it. I forget how he spelled his first name, but it was Martinez. His brother is a doctor who has a clinic in Louisiana, and he was a doctor at Parkland Hospital when John Kennedy was brought in there. When that notorious bullet, that mysterious bullet, the pristine bullet with no blood on it, was found on a stretcher, the brother of one of the Watergate gang who worked with this assassination team inside of Group 5412-2 was a doctor at Parkland Hospital. So we have to check out more about Mr. Martinez, one of the Watergate defendants, because Frank Sturgis was Frank Fiorini, who worked with Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, this article, as I say, came out a long time ago. It has to do with Nixon's friendship with E. Howard Hunt and their trips to South America when Hunt was a senior CIA agent. But the crux of this article, the reason I bring it up again, is because it was inside the National Security Council and the Defense Intelligence Agency, but under the protection of National Security Council. And again, this is the American volunteer group, volunteer gladly. The FREIKORPS were all volunteer, believe me. They didn't have a conscription to take them in. So the volunteer group was part of the overthrowing of Germany and bringing in Adolf Hitler, even though it was an electoral process, creating the FREIKORPS in 1951, and then the Germans working in Munich, Germany with General Walker. He was the most visible. I'm sure there were many others. And bringing it to the United States under Nelson Bunker Hunt and people from our Defense Department, FBI, and CIA, but calling it the American Volunteer Group, which formed itself into the American FREIKORPS, whose goal is to overthrow America and destroy America, just as that trial is going on the Aryan nations in Seattle, with their stated goal to destroy America and bring what Hitler wanted, which was control of the world, and our American FREIKORPS is going to bring that about. I may as well just run down this outline as long as it's here and give you these names quickly, the connections to what I'm trying to explain about that reunion and the timing process of it and what is happening today. As I mentioned before, Gerhard Frey is one of the propagandists in Germany, a well-known publisher, who was in touch with General Walker. Walker called him. This story about Lee Harvey Oswald and Walker had no evidence that any bullet taken out of his house matched Lee Harvey Oswald's gun or rifle at all. And Frey is a person in Germany who was writing articles before Kennedy was killed, disliking Kennedy and tantamount to calling him a traitor to the United States or to the world or to his goals at the time that Kennedy went to Dallas. Nelson Bunker Hunt was paying for an ad calling Kennedy a traitor in the United States. Now, the Walker shooting, I've put on the air many times, was arranged, according to the information I have, by Green Berets. They were formed by Nazis brought over here from Germany, and Mr. Six, S-I-X, in North Carolina. And a fellow, James Frankenberry, is the one who sent me all these documents about Watergate defendants E. Howard Hunt meeting with gentlemen who were training to shoot into the Walker home, not to kill Walker, but Walker would have an excuse to say, well, that communist shot at me. Now, General Walker brought from Munich, Germany, Volkmar Schmidt, Larry Schmidt. Volkmar lived at his house. Larry Schmidt worked with the John Birch Society, and they infiltrated to take over Young Americans for Freedom. And this group became the military FREIKORPS, and on broadcasts I've done with and about them, with that information from the Warren Commission hearings, Volume 18, primarily, they were saying we have to produce the bodies and run. We're not here for our own sake. And in the article I wrote for Rebel in 1963, I have a long section on General Walker and the people he brought from Munich, Germany, that some of these other researchers won't touch. And it's about time, after 22 years, that some of you write to them and pressure them and ask them, why have you never gone into this? Now, General Walker was working with Nelson Bunker Hunt, with the American Volunteer Group, the assassinations like the FREIKORPS, and the Hunts and Murchisons were behind the support of the survivalist magazines, along with Singlaub, who came off the staff of Senator of Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific. Later he worked with Senator Joe McCarthy, but Singlab came out of the Pacific with MacArthur and Willoughby. Charles Willoughby, was he Sir Charles Willoughby? Willoughby, incidentally, was knighted by the Vatican along with some very important people. A man in Arizona, no, he lives in Houston, Texas, Mr. Landcamer, sent me a page of the Sovereign Order, the Military Knights of Malta of 1967, and there's Major General Charles A. Willoughby, Mr. Wiedenbach, who I wrote about in my Rebel article, and he worked with the very people in Dallas, Texas. On the Young Americans for Freedom board was Ronald Reagan, Charles Willoughby, this Knight of Malta. Also knighted or part of the Military Affairs Committee with Willoughby was Rear Admiral Francis T. Spellman, and Roy Cohn of Western Goals was the liaison between Spellman and J. Edgar Hoover through our entire Cold War period. Incidentally, one of the Knights of Malta, interestingly enough, is Rear Admiral Richard Black, who's in charge of the Antarctic territories and exploration, and I say that's one of the most important parts of our American history. So General Walker had these connections right to the American Volunteer Group and Nelson Bunker Hunt's desire for these death teams that were training in California and were directly linked to Clay Shaw, to the Nazis in South America, to Argentina, to Bormann, and Clay Shaw was that common denominator, and I've done some broadcasts on that. Now, Gerhard Frey was the other side of him, the General Walker connection. He was in touch with Mr. Naumann, Goebbels' right-hand man, who was in the bunker up to the end with Martin Bormann and Hitler and Goebbels. Naumann set up the FREIKORPS in Germany. Walker, if you take your right and left hand and draw them out, General Walker was helping set up the FREIKORPS in America, and Naumann in the 50s was setting up the FREIKORPS with Hans Ulrich Rudel in Germany, starting in 1951. And Karl-Heinz Hoffmann, that fellow I keep saying I'll do the broadcast on, hopefully next week maybe, has an identical magazine to Soldier of Fortune in Germany. He's in jail right now with his wife for having killed an Italian publisher, but I'm sure he'll be out very soon. And Hoffmann's money came from Gerhard Frey, and he was funded. He's one of the publications. He's the head of the Young Freikorps group there of Nazis, and I mentioned his name just last week or the week before in terms of the reunion in Belgium of the Nazis in their SS uniforms and bringing their children. Now, they run survivalist magazines and gung-ho type magazines and Soldier of Fortune. So all of them European youth and around the world, the Nazis, headed the largest group by Hoffmann, funded by Gerhard Frey. In America, you have the Nelson Bunker Hunt, the Murchison, and Singlab setting up the American Freikorps in this country. And as again I say, the common denominator here is Hans Ulrich Rudel and Otto Skorzeny, who could float in and out with both groups. Now, Frey and Naumann's assistant in this operation, who helped set up the Freikorps in 51, that Rudel then makes his connections to Argentina with Juan Perón. It's very important for me to take a lot of individual names and accumulate them for you in one broadcast, even if you can't remember all of them, because I've done separate broadcasts on them individually. And now all this material is coming together. It's just flooding together. Every book I read, everything I see, every article ties together more clearly the individual pieces of the puzzle that I've been sharing with you for the past 14 years. From time to time, I've referred to an article, Los Angeles Times, June 7th, 1980, and I just want to run through it real quickly because our time is almost up, titled Wealthy Join Movement to Carry Gospel to the World. And it's about 100 men that have come together to raise $1 billion to turn the entire world Christian. The drive is led by Nelson Bunker Hunt, the man who set up the private assassination group, the volunteer group. Another person who contributes is William R. Bright, and the article says that Bright, a small-time businessman, launched a campus crusade in 1951 at UCLA and now has an organization worth over $49.2 million. That was in 1979. Now, 1951 was the exact date decided in Germany. in 1944 where the Freikorps would begin in Germany, and it was formed by this Mr. Naumann, who works with General Walker and Gerhard Frey. Walker brings people from Munich, Germany, American Army, to the United States to melt with Nelson Bunker Hunt, and Mr. Bright has organized in 51, the exact year, on our campus in the United States, the same thing that was taking place in Germany with the common denominators in Germany. Other people part of this organization are President Gerald Ford, former President Ford, who was on the Warren Commission and covered that up, of course, and John Connally, very much part of the assassination, a member of Permanex, described in the Torbett document. Leon Jaworski, another attorney for the Warren Commission who knew that Lee Harvey Oswald was in the CIA and FBI. And I'll put that document about Jaworski's knowledge of that into Ted Gandolfo's newsletter so you can see it for yourself. People from the John Kennedy assassination, Mr. William Bright, Nelson Bunker Hunt, Clint Murchison, and John Connally, and the whole team, Gerald Ford, became part of the Operation 1980 to turn the entire world Christian, which is different than Adolf Hitler just getting rid of the Jews. If everyone wears a cross, then the Jews will stand out. Instead of the Jews wearing the star this time, everyone else will have a cross, and then you'll know who the Jew is. He'll either wear a cross or you'll know right away. Well, these teams have, I've rushed through it. I can't do it justice for just 1 hour, but these teams have connected, as I say, through the books that have been published before that I'm rereading, the articles I'm rereading, and seeing them in a different light now. Even though I thought I was looking for a certain thing before, it is more in focus now than ever, and I'll continue to share it with you. There was so much in the news this week. I had, like I say, the 50 top stories, and I got to 3. But let's settle for that and stay well, and we'll still collect the other material and use it very soon, I hope. In the meanwhile, this is Mae Brussell, and you take care, and I'll be back with you next week.